And so in that moment, Bear was not only, I think, showing empathy, right? Knowing that I was afraid and trying to appease me, but also knew what I knew. He knew that I knew what had happened the day before, and that's why I was so afraid. Would we go to a prison and measure those capacities and say, okay, that's the sort of standard or baseline measure of this cognitive capacity? We would not do that because we wouldn't see that as representative of the species on the whole. But that's what we're doing with other animals all of the time, right? If it can look so different from ours, what about organisms who have very simple nervous systems or who lack nervous systems altogether? And there's been so much work now on plants and fungi and slime molds and sponges, animals who either have very simple nervous systems or lack nervous systems, that show that they can learn, that they can remember, that they are solving all sorts of complex problems in their environments, often at speeds faster than the fastest human computers can. And so it does really start.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Heshiوار podcast. Today is my privilege to host Dr. Krestin Webb, the scientist and also the writer of the book Arrogant Ape. Krestin Webb is a primatologist, evolutionary biologist, and science writer whose work explores human evolution, animal cognition, as well as the cultural assumptions that shape how humans view themselves, as well as the other forms of life. She completed her academic training in evolutionary biology and primatology, and during her early career served as a lecturer in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University, where she also taught a seminar called the Arrogant Ape, or a class, I guess. Dr. Webb was intellectually shaped by her training and mentorship under prominent and leading figures in primate research. I will ask some questions about that. And this comparative anti-anthropocentric perspective underlies much of her writings. Today, she is an assistant professor at the New York University's Department of Environmental Studies with a focus on animal behavior, cognition, and environmental ethics. Her book, The Arrogant Ape, The Myths of Human Exceptionalism and Why It Matters, was just published a few months ago in September, I guess, by Avery, an imprint of the Penguin Random House. This is a book, maybe you can see, I can. So this is available in major bookstores as well as Amazon. I will include a link to the book. It's a very well written, and I highly recommend you can read. We will discuss about the main topics that Dr. Webb covered in this book. I'm trying to talk to the publisher. Hopefully I can translate this book, and working with the publisher inside Iran to after the publication of the Animal Liberation. So this may be a complementary book to those concepts about animal rights, about how we look ourselves in the universe as well as on Earth. So this book has attracted many discussion in academia as well as the public forum. As I saw, you can search Dr. Webb's name and you can see some podcasts and lectures that she discussed about this book as well as the other aspects of her research. This was very well received. I see lots of praises and also complimentary in the back of the book. I don't want to read all of them, but only one of them that has been written in the front from David Abram, the author of The Becoming Animal, a profound takedown of the human supremacy complex, a deeply felt work, empathic and curious and wonderstruck. So it's a very good book. So I try to ask some questions about each chapter. Dr. Webb, again, welcome to Heshiوار podcast. It's my privilege to host you today.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
So as an opening question, I would like to go back to your education or background, how you became a primatologist and interested in animal behavior. I know you have worked closely with some prominent figures in this area, including the late Frans de Waal. who was famously critical of human exceptionalism, as well as deeply influential in how we look at ourselves in the universe, as well as on Earth, and relationship with other animals, and also morality. How did working under his mentorship, I see you mentioned somewhere that you see him as your main mentor and you learn a lot about not only the science as well as how we see ourselves. How working with him directly or indirectly affected your intellectual thinking and promoted you to write maybe this book?
Great question. Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to meet Frans when I was an undergraduate at Emory. He taught a course there called Primate Social Behavior, which I enrolled in, I believe my sophomore, maybe first semester of my junior year. And I was blown away by this class. I had had a lifelong love of other animals. I became fascinated by evolutionary theory in high school. And suddenly I'm at a university and there's courses on animal behavior and primate behavior. I didn't even realize that this was a career that one could pursue. So Frans, not only at that very early stage in my training and education, just opened my eyes to the possibility of a career in primatology, that this is something you can actually get paid to do. But then under his mentorship, I ultimately, after that class, ended up working in his lab and continued working with him throughout graduate school and into a postdoc. I learned so many things about studying other primates and other forms of life more generally, perhaps most of all, to approach that research with immense humility and an opportunity to let the other animals teach you who they are as individuals with rich internal worlds and lives. He didn't shy away from questions about the mental life of other animals, something that scientists often see as taboo, right? To talk about the subjective experience of other species. And he never shied away from that. And I think that shaped my research in profound ways.
Thank you. So this brings me to a question about Jane Goodall, who unfortunately passed away a few months ago. I'm not sure you directly worked with her or met her during your career, but she was also influential in this research area, as well as you mentioned that like 50 years ago or even before that, it was hard for scientists, even women, to work on this area, as well as I remember she was describing a memory about calling some of the chimps by name. At that time, they were only called by numbers. But after that, her work and late Frans de Waal works caused that understanding of other creatures, including animals, sentient animals, changes a lot. Have you met Jane Goodall, or can you say a few words about her achievements as well as the legacy she put in this area?
Sure. Yeah, I didn't actually know Jane Goodall personally or work with her. We had intersected at various conferences and events. And you're absolutely right. I mean, her legacy was one that really pushed the boundaries of the scientific establishment. She went into the field for the first time, not as a trained scientist. She was actually a secretary of the famous Louis Leakey, who selected her to go and study the chimpanzees in Gombe, in part because she would have a fresh lens on their behavior. And yeah, she used words like culture to describe their behavior. She used names as opposed to numbers. But as a result of that kind of personal identification with other animals, what some might call anthropomorphizing them, she was able to gain so much information about their lifestyles and their behaviors. And she's, I think, a part of a legacy of women primatologists, right? You could also put Diane Fossey and Ruti Gladikas. There's other primatologists in this camp who really changed our understanding of other primates, in large part because they approached the study of them very differently. And I'll just say, anecdotally, what's so fascinating about Jane Goodall, and one of the reasons I'm so grateful to her, is that primatology today is a women-dominated field. So it's one of the few natural sciences in which women are not underrepresented at all. You go to primatology conferences and there are mostly women. And I think that's in no small part because we had role models like Jane Goodall and these other women primatologists whose legacy we could try to emulate and follow.
Thank you. So for the audience who hasn't maybe followed the Heshiwar podcast, I have also hosted Professor Robert Sapolsky. He's a later generation of the primatologist, but he has also worked with baboons. I think you also work with baboons. You may know him well. So go and maybe watch those. We talk about different topics, including free will, and also some of the examples he gave us about working with animals, including baboons. But I have a question. So you start the book with the experience you had with a baboon. So you experienced that the baboon came to you and then showing his teeth. So that's a very good example how they can have like a theory of mind that feeling other people's or other animals. So this was a new thing before, like before we thought maybe only humans, they have this kind of sense of theory of mind. Could you please explain that experience to the audience who hasn't heard about that?
Sure. Yeah. So I had an encounter with a male baboon, a juvenile male baboon named Bear. I think this was in 2019 or so, many years ago. And it was an encounter that really changed my understanding of other animals and what they're capable of. And basically, Bear, like many juvenile male baboons, was testing the limits, testing boundaries within his own social group and also with the team of human field researchers that were following this troop of baboons, which meant that he was often doing things like climbing our legs, trying to steal our GPS systems or get into our backpacks. He was just causing trouble. And one day he was doing this, but things got a bit out of hand. So he and a bunch of other baboons ended up mobbing one of my colleagues who I was also in the field with that day. They surrounded her. They were barking and slapping her legs. And it was a very tense, scary moment for everybody. She was okay. She wasn't injured in the end, but very, very scared. And it wasn't clear exactly what had happened, but that Bear was involved and likely instigated it in some way. And the next day, well, I should say that evening at dinner, the group of researchers, we contemplated maybe we shouldn't actually continue to follow this troop of baboons because things are escalating and somebody could actually get really hurt. It seems like there's this sort of trust between the humans and the baboons that is at stake. And so maybe we shouldn't follow this troop for a little while. But we decided that we would follow them the next day, but keep a greater distance. So I was on with the same troop the next day, and I was keeping my distance, trying to stay pretty far away on the periphery of the group. And all of a sudden, I see Bear in the distance, and he is making a beeline for me. And I'm in a very precarious position. I'm kind of wobbling down this steep, rocky incline, and I can't easily get out of his way. And he's coming towards me, and he has a little posse of other baboons behind him. And I knew that if I were to act, afraid, that wouldn't necessarily be a wise decision or move on my part. So I tried as much as possible to act and look calm. But deep down, I was quite scared. I thought, okay, now Bear is going to do something to me. And he gets closer. Finally, he's right next to me. And he puts his hand in between my hiking boots. And he looks up at me and he bares his teeth into this very awkward and forced grimace. I remember it so clearly because I had never seen baboon teeth that up close before, and they're very white. It almost looked like fake how pristine and white they were. And as a primatologist, I know that this is a pacifying gesture. This is something that baboons do to avert conflict with one another, to reconcile with one another, to show respect or subordination to another individual. And so in that moment, Bear was not only, I think, showing empathy, right? Knowing that I was afraid and trying to appease me, but also knew what I knew. He knew that I knew what had happened the day before, and that's why I was so afraid. We call this theory of mind, the ability to know or understand what another is thinking or feeling. It's closely related to empathy. So Bear had a theory of mind and an empathic response to my behavior. And this was something that I had learned in graduate school that only humans were capable of doing. There have been a lot of interesting studies since that time showing that baboons and many other animals are capable of empathy and theory of mind responses. But this was a personal encounter that taught me a lot.
That's interesting. So whoever has some pets, animals, like including dog, I have a dog as well. So they sense. So it's not only a training. So maybe they have some inherent sense of theory of mind. I know dogs are domesticated and maybe they learn some of this now and then it's now in their brain. But I think they have very a strong sense of theory of mind, and they feel their owners like feeling. This is not limited to dogs, as you're saying. Maybe there are some chimps, baboons, and also some other mammals, including maybe other animals. They have this kind of sense, which is important. We come back to the animals right later because you discuss about this and relates to how we look other sentient beings. But going to the first chapter, you argue that human exceptionalism, that the main core, the keyword that you use in your book, is not just a cognitive bias. It's a deeply embedded in ideologies as well as infiltrated science as well. So you have lots of example in the book. How, in your view, can we realistically practice a non-anthropocentric science when everything, like including tools that we use, the language, the questions, also the values that the kids also learn, this another chapter you talk about this as well, how we can draw the line between like scientific humility as well as the falling into this radical relativism.
Yeah, I'll just add really quickly back to theory of mind, because your example about dogs uh, and humans, it's interspecies theory of mind, just like my example with Bear the baboon is. And so it's an even more remarkable capability. It's not just knowing what others feel and think, but knowing what a member of another species feels and thinks.
Sure.
And to this question of how we can cultivate, a world and a science beyond the narrow frame of human exceptionalism, I think, and I argue in the book, that a big piece of it is recognizing the way that this bias is still alive and well in so much of our thinking today. Human exceptionalism is often invisible. It operates in this way where it's kind of everywhere and nowhere all at once. It's rarely named or acknowledged, at least in the kind of mainstream scientific discourse. And in that way, because it's not acknowledged, it sort of derives power. It's just normalized and seen as common sense, like, oh, of course humans are the only species that blah, blah, blah. Of course it makes sense that we, study other animals in cages to better our science. Of course, if we're studying other species, we measure and define intelligence by human-centric standards. It's sort of a taken for granted view of the world, and therefore, if it's not a bias that we even recognize as a bias, how are we supposed to address it? And so I would say the first step is learning to identify it, learning to see it. And from that point forward, there are, thousands, infinite number of ways that we can possibly address it. One, as you kind of mentioned briefly, has to do with our education systems. So as children, we're often taught that to understand nature, we have to harm nature. We have to dissect, frogs or sheep hearts or stomachs, or we have to cut down trees or uproot plants or kill insects, right? And I'm really curious about how, what if we just rethought education so we taught that learning about nature is not necessarily manipulating or harming nature, but about loving nature, learning from nature. And what if children grew up, in an education system that prioritized ecological literacy, where learning about the animals and plants around them was just as important as learning, being fluent in a particular language or in mathematics. So I think a big piece of it is early education.
Thank you. Also, I refer to what I also read in Professor Singer's book. He also argues that when we do testing on animals, like even small animals, like the worst behavioral test that was done like in 40s, 50s on some chimps as well as other primates. So he's arguing that if they are similar to human, so it's not a good thing we do this testing on them. If they are different, so these are not very useful testing on them if they are different. So this can be expanded to other animals as well, even mouse or rats. So I know some of them are necessary, and he argues maybe some of them might be inevitable to provide some drugs for curing some cancers or some of the diseases. But the field that I'm working is a stem cell field, like cell and gene therapy. So the field is also moving to mimic some of these testing on cells. Like we grow the cells in the cell culture and like organoids, for example, and try to add drugs instead of animals to add to the cell culture and then mimic those. So some of them are moving from the animal testing, and I think FDA is also accepting some of those testing to go to clinical trials. So there are some movement in this field as well to move away from some non-necessary animal testing, but he argues in his book still lots of animals are being used in academia for going to preclinical testing for drugs. So it may change, but it's much better than like a few decades ago, but still we have lots to go.
Yeah, I agree it's moving in the right direction, but he's absolutely right. There's a kind of paradox here where the justification for using other species is their biological and psychological similarity to humans, but shouldn't that very similarity raise ethical questions about doing this kind of research? And I think in the US, there's been a lot of pushback against using primates in biomedical research. But then the concern is, okay, well, then are we just going to pivot to using more rodent or fish models, right? And that is another problematic move because it's prioritizing and privileging those species who most resemble us, right? And when, there's many good reasons, both evolutionarily, ethically, why we shouldn't necessarily do that.
Yes, thank you. So I come back to the word that you use in your book when we work with these animals, or how we set up the experiments, some of the behavioral experiments that we do, even on humans, as well as the animals. So let me ask a question that you mentioned in the chapter 2 about the anthropocentrism and speciesism that also Peter Singer also talks a lot about this, are not innate in early childhood. You have examples in the book that some of the kids, they inherently, they love animals and they don't want to harm them. But it seems we acquire this through culture and language, schooling, training, and this connection from the nature. I always encourage people to have more connections to the nature because our ancestors, they were connected to nature much more than us. And then this cause maybe the humbleness, the seeing ourselves in connection with the nature and other humans. So practically speaking, what are the key mechanisms that move children from this biophilia, like the animals, toward the other things that you mentioned about some training in the schools, dissecting the animals. So how we can maybe improve this by training the children in our school?
Yeah. So I, along with other scholars, including Eileen Christ, she's a sociologist, have argued that human exceptionalism is not necessarily something that is explicitly taught, right? So it's not that kids go to school and in most cases, they're not seeing a teacher go up to the board and draw a hierarchy with humans at the top and other animals and plants and other forms of life below them. It's not necessarily this like explicit hierarchy of life that's taught to us, but rather human exceptionalism is something that is learned and internalized by taking very seriously the behavior of other humans around you. So when children first come into conflict and contact with harmful practices towards other animals, including factory farming, right? When they first start to realize that the food that is on their plate or the clothing that they're wearing actually comes from a dead animal. I mean, there's thousands, hundreds of thousands of YouTube videos about this very moment when children recognize the connection between what is on their plate, who is on their plate, and then the life that once was. And it's an incredibly disorienting and disturbing experience for them. I know that it was for me, but we live in a culture where those conflicts are sort of dismissed and normalized. People are, adults around you are kind of turning away from the dissonance, their own maybe emotional and ethical dissonance that they experience from those things. And then as we already discussed, they are entering education systems where the very way that we learn about nature through science, which is legitimized and has authority, could often be through doing harmful things to other forms of life. The language that we're using from a young age, you mentioned. So we use words like pork and beef instead of cows and pigs. We use terms like natural resources and ecosystem services, which portray nature as a resource, as a thing that is instrumentalized and can be used towards our own exclusive ends. The sort of like commodified language that we use to describe other forms of life is a real problem. And so I think rethinking the language we use, right? So instead of talking about natural resources and ecosystem services, we could talk about our lifelines and our neighbors. And, we could rethink the way that we're teaching kids about nature. And I think a big part of it, I must say, my main answer to your question would be, how can we reinforce what kids already know to be true about the world? How can we reinforce this belief that other animals are interesting and lovable and have internal lives, emotions, and experiences? How can we reinforce that perspective that children have on the world and not take them out of it? So sometimes I think it's not so much about teaching them new things, but just validating what they already know to be true.
Thank you. So I think part of that, really is about education, how we raise our kids, this connection with other animals. So if we bring a pet to our house, so they have a good feeling and they feel very good, and then they know they have emotions, they feel pain, and they suffer. So, but they are a little bit disconnected, not a little bit, a lot disconnected to other animals. When we purchase food, like a meat, even intentionally, some of these industry, they are disconnecting how they process the food and when they come to our table. So I think Peter Singer, again, I'm quoting him because I have recently translated his book. So he mentioned that if the walls of these animal farms are go away and there is a mirror or whatever, the glass, so they can see inside, maybe 90% of the people, they will not eat meat, at least the farm meat, because there are lots of suffering we see. But most of us, we are disconnected, and some of them are psychologically, even in my friends' family. So when I explain to them, they don't want to hear sometimes. So they know, but when I explain, they cannot see. So this is kind of psychologically, and it grows from childhood. So it's good to train the kids that they feel this connection with other animals as well. We don't fall in the speciesism trap.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, like, we're such conformists, right? So we're doing what other people do around us as children and as adults. And if most people around us were vegan, we would likely try to be vegan as well, because it would be the norm.
Yes. So, in Iranian, like Persian tradition, meat has like a central role. But I'm trying to, maybe by translating this type of books, and I know there are some priority in Iran because of the political and social and other aspects, but I think they can go parallel. Some people, they ask me, so why you prioritize like animals' right? I said, okay, so human right and animal right, they can go side by side. They can, we should, if the people are kind and generous to animals, they can be also kind and generous to humans. So I think,
Yeah.
so
And
most,
research shows a link
yeah,
between the two. So
yeah, there's lots of research around that. So, Dr. Webb, so in the chapter 3, you also talk about differential imperative. So a Western compulsion to make humans as superior, reinforced by agriculture, religion. You go back to history, the Descartian like view of mind and body, and coming to modern science. So could you please also elaborate a little bit the concept you discussed, and also the weird? You mentioned that also some of this coming from the traditions and history comes to science as well. So some of them research that we do is they are not well controlled, because we see animals in the cages. And I have a question about, you encountered some animals in cages as well. So please elaborate a little bit the concept in chapter 3 you mentioned about the weird as well.
yeah, so the differential imperative, to go to your first question, is a term that was coined by a political scientist named John Rodman to describe this almost compulsive need in Western culture to differentiate the human from the animal in order to justify or sanction the exploitation of other animals towards human needs and interests. And you can look throughout Western history, going back to Aristotle and Greek and Hellenistic philosophy, all the way, to contemporary science. And you can see that this compulsion to separate the human exists in many different shapes and forms. So you have Aristotle's scala naturae, right? This ladder of life that placed humans at the top, and animals that looked like us just below, and then, plants, and followed by, rocks and other inorganic matter. And you can see versions of this scala naturae get adopted in medieval Christianity, right? It's called the Great Chain of Being, which is kind of a version of the scala naturae, except instead of humans, well, humans are still at the top of the hierarchy, but actually just above them, sort of in the air, are gods and spirits, right? So humans alone sort of straddle the immaterial world of the spirits and God and angels and the material world. And then, as I argue in chapter 3, right, you would think that this idea, this differential imperative, would have been laid to rest with the relatively widespread acceptance of evolutionary theory in, the late 1800s and the 1900s. But actually, in some cases, the desire, the motivation to separate human from animal, that kind of doubled down, or efforts to do so doubled down in the decades that followed Darwin's Origin of Species. And so you can look at throughout, Western science, even at the characteristics that have been put forward to say, okay, this is the human being is the only animal who can do what? Have theory of mind, consciousness, self-awareness, religion, culture, language, rationality, you name it, right? There have been dozens, hundreds of capacities put forward to say the human is unique in this capacity. And so that's really the differential imperative. And as I kind of conclude the chapter, and I think we're kind of moving into chapter 4 with your second question about, you know, this differentiation between humans and other animals has often been a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the way that we study other animals has biased conclusions about their abilities. So if we study other animals in deprived physical and social environments, for instance, if we study a chimpanzee who lives in a cage and we're asking questions about their social cognition, about whether they have theory of mind or empathy, we're stacking the deck against them from the start. And studies like that might conclude that humans are unique in a particular social cognitive capacity, but it's not a fair comparison. And I argue that the only way that this is seen as good science is because human exceptionalism is still operating within the sciences.
Yeah, thank you. So you mentioned also about the uniqueness versus the exceptionalism. So uniqueness is different. So I think you can explain more. So we are different. So every animal, they are different and they have the uniqueness as well. So we cannot see like eagles. We cannot smell like dogs. So, but we have like a better intelligence, or we have a better like prefrontal cortex. We can have more like a thinking capacity or imagination, I can say. But this doesn't mean that we are in the top hierarchy of evolution. Every animal, they are evolving. And even the logo that I have for Heshiوار is wrong, because we see a baboon or chimp moving to a hunter-gatherer and moving to humans. So it's not linear. The evolution is not linear. They go different directions, and we are not humans are not the end point of evolution. Every animal, they are evolving, but because it's long, we cannot see the evolution. It takes millions of years sometimes for animals to evolve. So I would like you to explain the difference between uniqueness that you mentioned, as well as the exceptionalism, and the audience, they know they are different.
Yes, that's an important point. So I agree that humans may well have unique qualities that distinguish them from other forms of life, just as every species has their own unique ways of being and unique capacities. Human exceptionalism is different from something like human uniqueness, because human exceptionalism indicates that what is unique about humans is somehow more morally worthy or evolutionarily advanced than the distinctive features of other forms of life. So it comes back to the differential imperative, right? It's not just that we have to see differences between us and them, but that we're doing that in order to justify some kind of moral hierarchy. And yeah, I think I'm a little bit hesitant to say that, you know, even something like imagination or cognitive capacity is something that sets humans apart, only because so many of these features, these characteristics that have been put forward, these hypotheses have been debunked over time, right? But at the same time, I don't the sort of argument of the book doesn't rest on that. We can still say that humans are unique in their imagination or in their ability to manipulate and control the environment. The question is, does that make us exceptional? And I think, many people would agree that those characteristics shouldn't necessarily or don't necessarily result in a moral hierarchy that is defendable.
Thank you. So I was talking to some scientists in Heshiوار about consciousness recently, including Professor Tetse. So he's a prominent neuroscientist, and we talk about animal consciousness. I will ask more about that in later. And to add to what you mentioned, this is a spectrum. So even intelligence might be a spectrum as well as consciousness. It's not 0 or 1. So it's not something that only humans we say we have it and other animals they lack. So this is something that when I come to some animal conscious intelligent, I will ask. But I have a question. So you talked in your interview with Michael Sherburne, I guess, so about your encounter animals in the cage, and you also highlight in your book that even the rats or mice, they may sense if the operator or the experimental person is woman's or men's. So, and it caused some of the hormones changing in their bodies and also caused some questioning about the validity of the experiments that scientists they are doing. So, because, for example, they measure some hormones, but it affects if the operator is a woman or man. So you go to this like extreme that we have to pay attention when we set up an experiment, how animals are being behaved in cage, or even humans. You come to the word, so the Western industrial, like a democratic kind of experiment that you mentioned. Maybe most of the experiment, even especially the psychological experiments, have done on whitish, like Western people, like educated people, like in first year, like a college, this kind of thing. So maybe can you elaborate this before we go to some consciousness awareness in animals?
Yeah, sure. So most claims of human cognitive uniqueness today rest or come from studies, rest on studies that have compared the cognitive abilities of captive great apes with the cognitive abilities of weird human beings who are generally, fully autonomous. So weird is an acronym that stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and Democrat. And just as you said, it's like college undergraduates. These are mostly the participants in psychology research today. Even though they are highly unrepresentative of humanity on the whole, they're when it comes to what we know about human psychology and these sort of norms or standards, right? It's based on weird populations. Even though they're highly unrepresentative of humanity on the whole, they have a really outsized impact on our knowledge of psychology, on psychology research. And similarly, the chimpanzees in these studies are highly unrepresentative of chimpanzees on the whole. As I was mentioning before, they live in these highly deprived social and physical environments. They've often been separated from their biological mothers at birth. They're very stressed. It's not a valid context in which to measure something like cognition or social cognition. If we wanted to measure human cognition, let's say the human capacity for cooperation or empathy, would we go to a prison and measure those capacities and say, okay, that's the sort of standard or baseline measure of this cognitive capacity? We would not do that because we wouldn't see that as representative of the species on the whole. But that's what we're doing with other animals all of the time. And this isn't just a problem for cognitive research, as you were mentioning, right? This is the entire edifice of biomedical research is based on using animal models, animals who live in cages that are an infinitesimal proportion of their natural home range, right? That's true for rodents as much as it's true for primates. And there's this assumption that somehow by keeping animals in that environment, right, where we're able to control all sorts of extraneous variables, and therefore it's the best way that we can actually study the effect of interest. But of course, studying animals in that kind of environment introduces all kinds of other problems into the data, including the fact that these animals are often not healthy biologically or psychologically, right? Because they're living in deprived environments. Even if all of their sort of basic needs are met, they're not able to travel, migrate, socialize with others. So we know this from the COVID lockdown experience. This is not a healthy way of life for these animals, for these social animals. And yet biomedical research is resting on the assumption that these are healthy, normal individuals. And they're absolutely not. And there's a reason why I think only 1 and 9 drugs that like succeeded in an animal model actually translate to human successful outcomes in human clinical trials. And I think it's in large part because of this false assumption, right, that these animals are actually healthy. And as you were mentioned, this amazing study where rodents were able to perceive the gender of the experimenters who studied them. I think this is a perfect example of how we think we've controlled all the variables that matter in a captive or laboratory environment, but actually something as seemingly subtle as the gender of the experimenter can drastically alter the findings. And so turns out that rodents have higher cortisol responses when they're handled by men experimenters. And this has huge impacts on the scientific results that come from these studies.
Thank you. Fantastic. So yeah, I'm not sure how we can move away from some of the animal studies that prerequisite or necessary by regulatory agencies to go to preclinical studies. So I'm in this field, so still we do like tox studies. So they inject cells or genes, whatever, to small animals, even large animals, to prove that it's working, and then they can maybe submit to FDA to go to clinical trial. But still, as you mentioned, some of them cannot be translated. So they have a good data in animal studies, but it fails later in human because they could not control all variables, including the captivity of the animals in the cages, and especially if they are in psychological like a field or affecting the hormones or some of the small molecules in the body. So it brings me to chapter 5, that you argues that most measurement of intelligence, self-awareness, languages are grounded in human unwealth. So that's a term that I forgot the name. So you brought this. You can maybe explain more. So it's systematic mismeasurement of other species' capacity. So we know that for some time we thought maybe animals cannot use tools. But for example, late Jane Goddard showed no. Yeah, they can use like a wood stick. They can put inside the beehive or ant like a nest. They can use that. And now this line is moved. So now you mentioned that language also is not unique. So the way that we talk might be unique to humans, but you mentioned maybe some birds, they have different type of language. They communicate to each other that we can interpret that as language, the way that we speak. So this line is moving. So we have to maybe pay attention to this definition of intelligence. And I come to consciousness after that. If you please add to this as well.
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned the Umwelt, which is a German word.
Umwelt.
Yeah, meaning environment. It was coined by a German researcher, biologist, Jakob von Uexküll. I might not be pronouncing his name correctly, but he was using this term to refer to the kind of sensory world that an animal inhabits. And so, yeah, humans are a visually dominant species, right? We inhabit a particular sensory world, but other animals experience the world in radically different ways, right? Primarily through a sense of smell or touch, or even, senses that we don't have at all, including being able to detect magnetic fields, right? Or electricity. And I think one of my favorite examples of how we often use human intelligence as the benchmark for intelligence, and therefore don't adequately assess and honor other animals' intelligence, comes from research on self-awareness. So in humans and other primates, the way that we've often tested for self-awareness was through something called a mirror self-recognition task, which basically presents a participant with a mirror and surreptitiously had placed a mark on the participant's face or body. Then you present the participant with a mirror and you look and see, does the participant orient towards the mirror in a particular way that shows that they recognize that it's them? Do they try to remove the mark or spend more time paying attention to the mark. And humans and other primates, most other primates, have passed the mirror task. And for many years, it was assumed, okay, then they have self-awareness. They can recognize themselves as distinct from others. But many other species failed this task, including dogs. So dogs failed the mirror self-recognition task, which, as anybody who lives with dogs would say, well, that doesn't make sense to me. I'm pretty sure my dog is self-aware and sees herself as distinct from other dogs. But coming back to this Umwelt concept, humans and other primates perceive the world primarily through vision. But what about dogs and wolves, right? Who perceive the world primarily through their sense of smell. And so researchers ultimately devised a task, a mirror task that was based on smell, where effectively they present dogs, and they've done this study with wolves and other canids, with a mirror, an olfactory mirror of themselves. So a can that contains their own smell, their own urine, or a canister in which that smell has been slightly modified. And dogs can easily distinguish between the olfactory image of themselves and the one in which that scent has been altered. And so through their own sensory world, through their own Umwelt, they exhibit self-awareness. And yet when you look at the dog cognition research today, the vast majority of that research, or the vast majority of studies done on dog cognition, still rely on visual test paradigms.
Yeah, that's maybe because we see ourselves as a center, and then everything we compare with ourselves. So I'm very interested in consciousness. In chapter 6, you talk about the consciousness, non-human consciousness. So this was released yesterday, and the audience can watch and listen. So the majority of the scientists, they agree that consciousness is a spectrum. It's not 0 and 1. And then because I have a question about some of the views that you have about the consciousness, it goes even to maybe plants in some kind of forms that depends how we interpret the consciousness. And we don't know much about this subjective experience, that the qualia that is being discussed in philosophy. So still, I don't know how you see the red color, for example, versus how I see it. We know that both of us, we see it red, but the quality of the red, or how we see outside world, or how we sense, is subjective. Animals, they have this subjective experience, as we mentioned, but they interpret differently. Maybe a bat is through echolocation, or through the sound or waves, they interpret the world, and they have this kind of subjective experience. It's hard to prove, but it's most probably they have this kind of subjective experience. So you mentioned that about the consciousness, non-human consciousness is a standard that cause some of this anthropomorphism value or view that we have. What you can maybe propose as a pragmatic, like scientific friendly, that everybody can agree, at least talk about that. What type of evidence, like psychologically, physiologically, or evolutionary, we can put together to show the consciousness of a living being? So at least we agree maybe that non-living things are not maybe conscious. We don't want to go to panpsychism or some of the theories that are between the science and non-scientific field. But if we talk about the living things, talking about even plants or octopus, for sure, maybe they have consciousness. What do you suggest as the criteria to put together that we try to agree upon?
Yeah, so consciousness is one of these very elusive words and concepts in science and philosophy right now, where we don't really know what it is and how to measure it. The definition that most scientists and philosophers today use is that it's something that it's like to be. If you're conscious, that means there's something that it's like to be you. And while that is hard to prove, maybe impossible to prove in other animals, it's equally hard to prove in each other, right? How can I know with absolute certainty that you are conscious? I can't. know that, right? And this is the problem, the so-called problem of other minds. And I think there's a lot of double standards in how we kind of approach the study of consciousness and our understanding of consciousness and when we study humans and other animals. But as far as like the kind of key pieces of evidence that scientists today can agree upon as being indicative of a conscious life and experience, a lot of the research, unfortunately, comes from research on pain and suffering. So can we see if another animal is experiencing a painful stimulus, right? And is not just having some sort of like automatic reflex, right? We know that pain is a complicated phenomenon where it's a subjective experience of pain. It's not just an automatic withdrawal response. So when we put our hand on a hot pan, right, we automatically withdraw our hand before we actually have a subjective experience of pain. And so scientists have sort of separated the first bit when you have this reflex withdrawal response, that's called nociception. And then the subjective experience of pain that later comes is what we would say is indicative of a conscious experience, right? It's something that we feel. But you can separate those things out. You can, even in humans, you can tease those things apart. Some people might not actually have the experience of pain, but they have the reflex. And so then the question is, well, what about other forms of life? Is it just nociception? Is it just the reflex? Or are they actually experiencing something? And the kinds of studies that people find very convincing that have been done will show that, okay, if you administer, let's say they've done a lot of studies with fish and pain research. So if you inject a trout's lips with a toxin, how do they respond? Do they have like an immediate response, or is the response lasting? And what they found is that if you do something harmful to an animal, they will often try to protect that part on their body. They will often avoid the area where, or avoid the place where they received that harmful stimulus. They will, rub or try to soothe that area of their body. If they are given the opportunity for a pain reliever of some sort, they will actually spend more time in the water that has pain reliever, right? All of these bits of evidence are an indication that they're not merely experiencing an automatic reflex, but that they're experiencing a prolonged subjective experience of something negative that they want to avoid or make better. And so, yeah, I could go on, but I think I'll stop there as sort of those are some key pieces of evidence, at least in the animal literature, that most scientists today agree upon as indicative of a conscious experience.
Yes, fantastic. So I think lots of evidence are accumulating around fishes as well as lobster for sure. So I know some European countries, some United States, like states in the United States, so they banned like boiling the lobsters directly because they suffer or they have like some pain. So that's a good thing, but still the evidence is accumulating around the fishes as well. So you push beyond the neuroexceptionalism because some scientists argue that for animal, like a sentient animal, to be conscious or feel these kind of things that you mentioned, they have to have some neurons, like a specific number. I forgot number, maybe 20 million, or I forgot the exact number, or there is a kind of range of those neurons. But you show that sophisticated problem solving in nature, in not mammals, like not animals, for example, plants or slim molds, they do these type of things, and you want to maybe encourage the audience who also read your book to think about maybe going beyond. But some people argue that, okay, we need to eat something. Yes, we need to survive. So I'm trying to be a vegetarian now. So it was hard, I have to confess, but I think I'm moving forward to be a vegetarian maybe then maybe veganism. But I think people argue when I talk to them, so they said, no, what about if in the future they show that plants also feel pain, or they sense, or they have kind of a consciousness in a different term. So what do you think about this? Because you also discuss about moving this kind of spectrum to non-humans as well, including plants.
Yeah, right. So when you were saying before that consciousness is a spectrum, right? It's not 0 or 1. I agree with that, and many other scholars who are, saying that. But I think there's something about a spectrum too that can still suggest, okay, there's a spectrum from 0 to 1, and the 1 is human, right? So the more human-like something is, the more likely they are to be intelligent or conscious. And I address neuro-exceptionalism in the book because I had my own experience of realizing, okay, I originally thought, well, you have to have a brain to be intelligent or conscious, and you have to have a brain with a certain like blueprint or architecture, and it's going to look like humans, or it's going to be, like other primates, right? We have a large frontal cortex, we have a particular neural blueprint, and we know that these species are intelligent, and so that's what is required to be intelligent. But then all of this other research was coming out on birds and other forms of life who have totally different brains, right? Either much smaller brains, totally different structures, architecture, different, connections, and different numbers of neurons. And they showed through that research that, okay, birds outperform many primates on lots of cognitive tasks, but they have these really, really small brains. We ridicule their brains, right? We call it a bird brain. We say that's very small and stupid. But actually, that research started to teach me that you don't necessarily need a particular kind of brain to be intelligent, that different blueprints can lead to different forms of intelligence. And from there, one, I think, has to start questioning, okay, but then do you need a brain at all, right? If it can look so different from ours, what about organisms who have very simple nervous systems or who lack nervous systems altogether? And there's been so much work now on plants and fungi and slime molds, and sponges, animals who either have very simple nervous systems or lack nervous systems, that show that they can learn, that they can remember, that they are solving all sorts of complex problems in their environments, often at speeds, faster than the fastest human computers can. And so it does really start to raise questions about, okay, do you need a brain at all to be intelligent? And then this question of consciousness always comes up again, right? This elusive notion of is there then something that it's like to be a plant? And then do they suffer? And therefore, what do I eat? And I all my classes in which we talked about neuroexceptionalism ended on the same question of, students who are trying to be vegan or vegetarian, and they're like, well, what do I eat now? Because if there's a possibility that plants are conscious, where does that lead me? And I actually had a paragraph about this in the book, but it got taken out. My answer to that question, there's many different ways you can answer that question. If we want to focus on like a strict, following Peter Singer utilitarian framework, then actually the most harmful thing to plants is animal agriculture. So animal agriculture kills far more plants to feed the animals than does traditional plant agriculture. So if we're really under this utilitarian framework of just preventing the most suffering, limiting suffering, and we believe that plants can suffer, then you can still consume a plant-based diet and know that you're doing your best to limit that form of suffering in the world.
Yes, I agree. So I think he also argues that we need to survive. Yes, we are human. We need to eat food, but it's good based on scientific evidence and what we know. We can choose from the lowest evolutionary beings, plants. For now, we know that they may suffer. We don't know for sure, but at least they neurological system, they don't have it, but at least the way that they work and live is different than sentient animals. At least we know this. So I think for now we have enough good rationale to eat plants, but in the future we can think about that. But I think at least we can diminish the suffering and pain in the world, so we can choose from the bottom of the evolutionary.
Yeah.
So
and even, I mean, one could argue that some plants, instead of thinking about things in terms of like higher and lower species, prefer to think, okay, like what is an evolutionary strategy of a plant? Some plants, like fruits, arguably want to be eaten, right? It's how they reproduce and survive. Through seed dispersal when mammals like us eat them, for instance. So, and then, most plants, they survive by, you can cut off like 80% of the plant, but they're still able to survive and reproduce. So they have a totally different evolutionary strategy. And I like to think a little bit more along those lines and thinking about, yeah,
that's good thing. So to add to what you mentioned, there are some scientific theories about consciousness that it can be expanded to plants as well. IIT, for example, integrated information theory is a scientific theory. Still, some scientists, they argue that it might go to pseudoscience because it doesn't have enough evidence and it cannot be falsified, or it cannot be forecasted for the future. But still is a scientific theory that Tonini and Professor Koch, Christoph Koch, they are defending. We are translating a book by Christoph Koch. The name is Then I Am Myself the Word. He argues about some of these consciousness, the spectrum of consciousness, and how if anything can process information, they think they can be kind of some degree of consciousness. So, and plants for sure, they process information as well, but it still is not anonymously accepted by scientific field like neuroscientists. But still, that's an open question that these scientific theories can be also be expanded to other creatures or even live things like plants. So going to your last few chapters, I have a few more questions. I don't want to take more time of you. So in chapter 8, you argue about competitive nature, which is the frame that will made in scientific field is incomplete and ideologically dangerous, from social Darwinism to justifying inequality and climate inaction. What is the single most important conceptual correction the public needs to know about evolution, can preserve the reality of competition among animals while properly centering symbiosis, cooperation between animals, and also the connections we have with them?
For me, at least, it was learning about Darwin's use of terms like survival of the fittest and struggle for existence. And those terms kind of naturally conjure up a competitive view of the world, right? Of individuals kind of selfishly vying to compete for status or resources. But Darwin actually borrowed those terms from his colleagues. He borrowed the struggle for existence and survival of the fittest in large part to make these ideas more digestible to a public that was also experiencing the rise of Victorian capitalism. And so these notions of, competing markets and individuals were very salient for people at the time. But when Darwin introduced the term struggle for existence, he says, and I'm going to quote him now, he says, I use this term in a large and metaphorical sense to refer to the dependence of one being upon another. So in The Origin of Species, he talks about an entangled bank where individuals are struggling together to survive. And that involves both competition and cooperation. And I think just understanding that Darwin's original language and terms, not necessarily the full scope of his argument and on the origin of species, and understanding that cooperation is a great force in evolution and nature, that was the single most important course correction for me.
Thank you. So moving to last two chapters, especially the chapter 9, you show that non-anthropocentric indigenous worldview are not only philosophical, but empirically linked to greater biodiversity and ecosystem resilience. If we truly abandon human exceptionalism that you argue, what do you think would need to change most urgently, like in science in general, that we both are working in this field, as well as in environmental policy and also human ethics?
Mm-hmm. I think, as I'm arguing in this chapter, one of, if not the most important things that we can do is support Indigenous scholars, Indigenous people in the work that they're already doing to understand the rest of nature. It occurred to me in writing this book that so much of the science that I was like trying to advocate for and cultivate a science that takes other animals' interests seriously, a science that doesn't shy away from the subjective life of the beings they study, a science that also takes seriously the relationship between the researcher and the participant. So many of these, I would say, like kind of frontiers of science are not at all new, but they're grounded in much older ways of understanding nature. And there's been some really exciting partnerships happening between Indigenous scientists and Western scientists that I think highlight the value of all of these different approaches at once, right? The sort of conventional scientific worldview and approach can have some merits, and Indigenous sciences have many of their merits as well. And so I think the more that we can, as the Indigenous botanist Robin Wall Kimmerer would describe, kind of weave these different sciences together and understand that they all have a role to play, the better position we'll be in to navigate the ecological crisis that requires, I think, working in better balance with other animals and plants and forms of life.
Great. So in chapter 10, you frame the awe as generating the small self, as how we see ourselves in the nature, as well as in the vast universe. You see a picture, my background. This is a butterfly nebula. I'm not sure about the size, but it's size that human cannot reach in a few decades or even hundreds of years from one side of it to the other side of it. So the universe is vast. So also you mentioned that removing this exceptionalism and thinking our place in universe and also in the world and connection cause humbleness, and also maybe help to solve some of the problems we have in the world, including climate change, in the politic, and also other aspects. How do you recommend, at least argue, that if we change our perception toward ourselves and remove ourselves as exception in the world, so maybe help us to solve some of these important human problems that we encounter now or maybe in the future?
Yeah, thanks. I like your background. Also, I've been admiring it. I think I need to follow your lead or something compared to my background.
Yeah, I am very, when I look at the microscope, so I work in the cell and gene therapy, working in the microscopic world. But
Yeah.
from my childhood, I also was interested to look at the sky. And I was talking to Professor Kelsey Johnson in one of the episodes. She's an astrophysicist, and she was a president of the American Astrology, like Astrophysics Society. She
Okay.
was also emphasizing about the sense of awe, that there are lots of research around this sense of awe, how we see ourselves, the connection to sky, connection to other animals, connection to nature. So this may
Yeah.
relate also to some of the conclusion you have in your book. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
why I put some of the backgrounds about these nebulas as well.
Well, and I think you can experience awe for both these grand spectacles, like your background, and also for what you observe through a microscope. Awe can be experienced in, these seemingly small but very complex and also vast phenomena. And yeah, there is absolutely a link between awe and humility. So awe begets humility, humility begets more awe. And how can, humility help us in the current situation we have caused and which we find ourselves today? There's been some really interesting work in philosophy on arrogance and why it's considered a vice. And it's considered a vice for two main reasons, a moral vice. One, because it prevents genuine relationships with other people, genuine friendships with other people, because as the arrogant person, you're always putting yourself above other people. And as a result, the second reason it's a vice is it prevents a genuine understanding of the self, because it's only through other relationships and friendships that we actually come to understand ourselves. And this philosophical work was done in the context of human to human relationships. But I'm really interested in thinking about how, if we think about arrogance as a vice, humility as a virtue can extend to human relationships with the rest of nature and other forms of life. So we know that humility confers better relationships, healthier relationships. It promotes a motivation to care for others, and then therefore to be cared for oneself. And what if we extended this research, right? That all of this amazing research that's been done on humility and having humility in relationships with other humans to thinking about our relationships with other animals and plants and other forms of life. And if I would imagine it would have the same impact, right? That if we entered into a humbler relationship with other forms of life, it would do the same thing as if we were, as when we're in humbler relationships with other humans. It would lead to a healthier, more balanced, richer, more fulfilling relationship. I think so much of the environmental crisis and the solutions to the environmental crisis are framed as things that we must give up and sacrifices and, long-term adverse consequences. And it's like, but what do we also stand to gain in cultivating a humbler and richer relationship with nature? And I think we stand so much to gain, not just other species, of course, but humans as well. So that's the overarching message. The end of the book is that we stand a lot to gain, both in terms of improving our relationships with others and understanding ourselves.
Thank you, Dr. Webb. I think this book is a powerful reminder that the ecological crisis is not only about technology or policy, but about the stories we try to tell ourselves to our kids, especially the story of human exceptionalism that Dr. Webb is arguing and discussing in the book. What I think you offer in this book is not only a set of easy answers that I understood from the book, but an invitation to come down to earth, to be humble and also get connected with nature and animals and rediscover the awe that you mentioned, that this sense of awe is very important. And most of the people who live in cities especially, they lose it because they lose the connection with animals, with plants, with nature, for many reasons. Yes, so some of them is inevitable. But I think you can show that this cause humility, and we rethink about our role and also location and also place in universe as well as the earth and relationship with other animals. Thank you for writing the book. So I try to maybe translate this book. I think maybe American or English speakers, they watch this, but many of my audience, they are from Iran, inside Iran, and they try to see and also think about that. I am trying to encourage this perspective view, and which is needed for Iranian society based on where we are now and in the history of Iran. So hopefully translating this type of book and having guests like you encourage people to think more about how we cooperate, how we relate to each other, and how we can work together to save our planet. Thank you for being my guest. So again, I put a link to this book. Sorry, it may not show well, but I think this is a very good book. So I put a link and I tried maybe to translate the book to Farsi. Hopefully after the translation, maybe next year, I can invite you one more time and we can go more detail, I may invite maybe another scientist or philosophers, and we can maybe have a like intellectual discourse or discussion about this book.
Yeah, it would be a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me and for your great questions.
Thank you so much. We will be in touch. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.